I've spent 17 years tracking what moves through forests when no one's watching, and I thought I'd seen everything darkness could hide. Then they handed me the file with trembling hands. 9 people gone without trace in 6 months, all within 5 miles of the Black Ridge woodland. What made my blood still wasn't the number, it was the map. Marked with boundaries the local tribes drew generations ago, territories they wouldn't cross even for missing family members. The officials called it superstition masking foul play, but I saw something else in those reports. No blood, no struggle, no logic. Just absence where people used to be. They chose me because I don't believe in legends. Because I've built my career on rational explanations for irrational fears. What they didn't know is that my grandfather used to wake screaming about the old woods, whispering warnings in a language I pretended not to understand. I accepted the assignment on a Tuesday that felt like a door closing behind me. My colleagues joked about finding Bigfoot while they loaded my gear, their laughter hollow in the morning air. I didn't tell them what I'd found in my grandfather's journals the night before, sketches of symbols and one line underlined until the paper tore. Some doors, once opened, were never meant to close. The forest waited like it had been expecting me, its entrance marked by silence too complete to be natural. I stepped across that invisible boundary, feeling the weight of every warning I'd ignored, every legend I'd dismissed with scientific certainty. Behind me, the modern world felt suddenly, terrifyingly far away. The markings appeared on the 4th day, carved into birch bark at precise intervals, forming a perimeter around the valley I'd claimed as base camp, not claw marks. These were deliberate, geometric, speaking a visual language that bypassed my conscious mind and struck something deeper. Each symbol seemed to shift meaning as I studied it, like trying to hold water in open palms, and I understood with creeping certainty that I was being read as much as I was reading. Time moved strangely there, hours collapsing into moments while seconds stretched into eternities of watchful quiet. My chronograph contradicted the sun's position, both insisting on different truths, and I stopped checking, either because the dissonance made my hands shake. The silence wasn't empty, but densely populated with attention. The forest holding its breath around me, and I felt observed by an intelligence that had been studying human patterns since before we named ourselves civilized. I found the impressions near the creek where no animal of that size should move so carefully. Tracks that demonstrated intentional placement, Isbeg avoiding soft earth that would hold deeper evidence. Whatever made them understood tracking, understood being tracked, and was teaching me the difference. The stride length suggested something massive moving with dancer's precision, and the depth spoke of weight distributed with impossible awareness. That night I abandoned my tent for the open ground, some instinct older than training telling me that walls would insult what circled my camp. I built no fire, made myself vulnerable and visible, and waited while the darkness gathered itself into purpose, knowing something ancient had been measuring my worth since the moment I crossed the boundary, deciding whether I deserved the truth or just another disappearance. The third night arrived with a heaviness that pressed against my sternum, the air thickening like the atmosphere before lightning strikes. I lay on the exposed ground, every nerve ending mapped in starlight, when the darkness across the clearing condensed into form, not emerging from the forest, but materializing from its essence, as if the woodland itself had decided to take shape. It stood 3 strides beyond the creek, motionless, and I understood immediately this was no animal, but something that predated that classification entirely. Its eyes found mine with a precision that stopped my breath, reflecting the moon with an amber luminescence that held no wildness, only a devastating clarity. This was not the gaze of predator assessing prey, but of an archivist encountering a half-forgotten text, reading my lineage, my intentions, the question marks my ancestors had left in their flight from these woods. The intelligence behind those eyes made my credentials, my training, my modern understanding feel like children's drawings. Presented to a philosopher, and shame I couldn't name flooded my chest. It moved closer with impossible silence, each step a negotiation with the earth rather than an imposition upon it, and I saw how its form seemed both solid and suggestive, wrapped in layers of moss and shadow that blurred the boundary between creature and forest. The smell reached me, rich humus, cedar resin, something else beneath like petrichor and thyme, and my body remembered this scent from a place deeper than memory, from the genetic archive where forgotten truths sleep. When it stopped an arm's length away, towering, I felt no fear of death but something more profound, the terror of being truly seen, of having every civilized pretense stripped away, leaving only the question of whether the human beneath was worth the revelation to come. My hands moved without conscious thought, reaching for the ground between us, fingers dragging through damp earth to sketch the symbols my grandfather had traced in firelight decades ago, circles within circles, the tree with roots mirroring branches, the human figure with arms extended toward something larger. They were fragments from stories I'd dismissed as folklore, yet my body remembered their shapes with unsettling precision. The Sasquatch's breathing changed, a low resonance that vibrated through the soil, and it lowered itself to a crouch, bringing those ancient eyes level with mine. With one massive finger, dark as wet bark and impossibly gentle, it traced a response beside my markings. Not mimicking, but answering, adding lines that transformed my simple drawings into something older, more complete. Like watching a child's sketch become the original blueprint, the gesture carried no threat, only a patience that felt archaeological, as if it had waited lifetimes for someone to remember even this much. I touched my chest, then gestured toward it, and the creature's head tilted in acknowledgement, a profoundly human motion that shattered every boundary I'd constructed between us. When it extended its palm toward me, I placed my hand against it, my entire hand disappearing against its calloused expanse, and felt its pulse, slow and deep as continental drift. Something passed between us in that contact. Not language, but recognition. The way distant relatives identify shared blood. Tears I couldn't explain tracked down my face. The forest around us seemed to exhale, and I understood. Communication had begun, not through my courage, but through my willingness to remember what my ancestors had forgotten. The Sasquatch rose before dawn each morning, leading me deeper into territories that felt less like geography and more like archaeology of consciousness. It would stop at seemingly random clearings, then drag those massive fingers through moss and bark, carving images that unfolded like photographs from a world I'd never known existed. Scenes of humans and forest beings standing together at boundary stones, maintaining something my grandfather's stories called the breathing space. Lands neither fully wild nor fully tamed. Each image struck me with vertigo, suggesting we hadn't conquered nature, but abandoned a partnership, walked away from a responsibility so ancient we'd forgotten we'd ever held it. On the fourth day, it showed me something that made my throat close. Drawings of modern logging equipment, mining operations, suburban sprawl, but rendered with such intimate detail that I understood this creature had watched us, documented our expansion with the patience of a scholar recording an extinction event. Beneath these scenes, it carved symbols of sickness spreading through roots, of silence replacing bird calls, of water that no longer remembered how to cleanse itself. Its finger moved with the precision of grief, and I recognized the posture. I'd seen it in veterans documenting atrocities they couldn't prevent. I tried to explain progress, medicine, feeding billions, but my justifications dissolved under those patient eyes. We'd broken something, and the breaking was so gradual we'd called it civilization. My hands shook as I traced my own acknowledgement in the soil, a human figure, separated, alone. The creature's massive hand covered my drawing completely, then slowly lifted, revealing it had added something, a path back. The Sasquatch led me beyond the boundary markers, into a valley where fog clung like memory refusing to fade. There, hidden beneath centuries of moss and deliberate camouflage, stood stone structures that predated any civilization I'd studied. Arches carved with the same symbols the creature had drawn, platforms arranged in astronomical precision. But it was the bones that stopped my breath. Human remains laid in careful spirals around seedlings, now grown into ancient trees, positioned as if the dead had chosen to become forest, had understood their bodies as continuation rather than ending. The creature knelt beside one arrangement, traced the skull with unexpected tenderness, then looked at me with an expression I finally recognized as grief mixed with purpose. It carved quickly in the earth, figures walking voluntarily into the forest, lying down among roots, transforming into something between human and wood, not victims but volunteers. The missing people hadn't been taken. They'd been called, selected perhaps, for some transition we no longer had words to describe. My mind reeled through the case files, reimagining each disappearance not as tragedy, but as answering. Had they heard something in the forest? I was only beginning to perceive. Had they understood the invitation I'd almost missed? The Sasquatch pressed my hand against one of the tree tombs, and I felt warmth, pulse. Something that suggested death was too simple a word for what happened here. This grove wasn't a graveyard, but a threshold, and the creature wasn't a killer, but a guide to a transformation hour. Species had forgotten was possible, becoming, finally, what we'd always belonged to. The Sasquatch's hand moved toward me, and I understood with sudden clarity that this was the moment of choice, not mine, but one made for me long ago. Its palm, rough as ancient bark and wide enough to cover my entire chest, pressed against my sternum with unexpected gentleness. Heat radiated through my ribs, not burning, but insistent, pulling something loose inside me I didn't know was tethered. Then the world inverted, and I was no longer myself but something vastly older, watching through eyes that had witnessed the first trees fall to human axes. The loneliness crashed through me like a physical force. Centuries of isolation, of being the last guardian standing watch while forests shrank to fragments. I felt the death of every sacred grove, tasted ash from fires set in ignorance and greed, carried the weight of a covenant broken so many generations ago that even the breaking had been forgotten. The creature's memories weren't its own, but inherited, passed through bloodlines of protectors who watched humanity's children grow into strangers who clear-cut their own heritage. Most devastating was the love beneath the grief, an incomprehensible patience that had waited through our amnesia, hoping we would remember. The Sasquatch had not hidden from us, but had been waiting, holding space for our return, maintaining the thresholds we would eventually need. I understood now why it hadn't fled. It recognized in me some dormant possibility, some genetic memory not quite extinguished. When the hand lifted, I collapsed to my knees, gasping, forever marked by the knowledge that I had just experienced the emotional truth of our planetary abandonment from the perspective of those we left behind. The revelation settled into my bones with the weight of ancestral shame. We were never meant to conquer the earth but to tend it, and somewhere in our ascent we had rewritten our own origin story, casting ourselves as masters rather than students. The Sasquatch stood before me not as a remnant of the past, but as proof of a path we'd abandoned, a path where intelligence meant harmony, where power meant stewardship, and where progress was measured in generations of trees, not quarterly profits. I thought of my grandfather's stories, dismissed as mythology in university classrooms, where we learned to catalogue and control rather than listen and belong. Those weren't fairy tales, but fragments of instruction manuals we'd burned, treaties we'd violated, warnings we'd translated into superstition so we could ignore them without guilt. The creature before me was a living library of everything we'd sacrificed for comfort, convenience, and the catastrophic illusion of separation from the web that sustained us. Tears carved tracks through the dirt on my face as I understood what haunted those ancient eyes. It wasn't anger at our betrayal, but grief at our forgetting, the specific sorrow of watching your own family become strangers who no longer recognize your face. We hadn't just lost our way, we'd lost the memory that there ever was another way, and creatures like this had remained behind as witnesses to our transformation into something the original world could no longer recognize as its children. The most terrifying part wasn't confronting this guardian of forgotten truths, but recognizing how easily I would have killed it a week ago, how thoroughly we'd been taught to destroy the very things that might save us from ourselves. Dawn approached with the reluctance of a final witness, golden light bleeding through ancient canopy like truth through denial. The Sasquatch rose to its full height, and I understood this was farewell. Not just to this encounter, but to an entire age of possibility that was closing like a door we'd ignored too long. Its massive hand swept toward the dying underbrush, then to the distant sound of machinery that never ceased, and finally pressed against the earth itself with a gesture so human in its desperation that my throat constricted. Through a series of low, resonant vocalizations that bypassed language and struck directly at instinct, it delivered the warning that indigenous elders had been screaming into deaf ears for generations. The boundaries were collapsing, not just territorial markers, but the fundamental separations that kept chaos at bay, that protected us from the consequences of our own unrestrained appetite. Soon, there would be no hidden groves left, no sanctuaries deep enough, no guardians patient enough to intervene when we stumbled too close to truths that would shatter our carefully constructed mythologies of dominance. The forest wasn't dying as a passive victim, but as an interconnected consciousness withdrawing its protection, and we were too numb to feel the cold that would follow. The creature's eyes held mine with an intensity that communicated the arithmetic of extinction. When the last guardian falls, when the final treaty dissolves, we wouldn't face their judgment but our own reflection, alone in a silence we'd manufactured. The drive back to the regional office took 4 hours, but I existed in a time outside measurement. The Sasquatch's final gesture, a palm pressed to earth in something between prayer and mourning, burned into my vision like staring too long at the sun. My recording devices had mysteriously failed. My photographs showed only blur and shadow, and the samples I'd collected felt absurd in their inadequacy, like bringing a teaspoon of ocean to prove the sea exists. At my desk, I opened the incident report template and stared at the blinking cursor, that demanding little line insisting I translate the untranslatable into bureaucratic language that would file the sacred into irrelevance. I wrote, "No evidence of criminal activity, and cases remain unsolved." The greatest lies I'd ever told, dressed in the costume of professional conclusion. But the real report writes itself in how I move through the world now, how I can't enter a grocery store without feeling the violence of 10,000 products screaming their disconnect from soil and season. I see my colleagues planning resource extractions and development projects, and I'm watching children play with matches in a library, convinced the books will burn forever. My silence isn't peace, but complicity. Yet who would believe that our greatest threat walks on 2 legs and looks back at us from mirrors? That monsters aren't hiding in forests, but building highways through them? The Sasquatch didn't show me where the missing people went. It showed me where humanity is heading. And the terror is that we're sprinting there willingly, calling it progress while the last guardians watch our species choose extinction with open eyes. Every night I dream of that massive hand on my chest and wake gasping, not from fear, but from the weight of carrying a truth that makes me a stranger in my own civilization. I've become what I once dismissed, someone muttering warnings that sound like madness, watching catastrophe approach with the specific agony of Cassandra, blessed with sight and cursed with disbelief. The files on my desk speak of missing persons, but I know the deeper disappearance is happening in boardrooms and city councils, In every moment, we choose convenience over consequence, comfort over covenant. The Sasquatch gave me the most terrible gift, the clarity to see we're not victims of some external apocalypse, but authors of our own erasure, and the ink is already dry on too many pages. Sometimes I drive back toward those mountains and sit at the forest's edge, hoping for another encounter, another chance to learn what I failed to understand. But the woods remain silent in a way that feels like withdrawal, like a parent who's warned a child too many times and finally steps back to let consequence be the teacher. I carry my grandfather's stories now like sacred texts, study indigenous wisdom with the urgency of a dying man seeking medicine, but I feel time running through my fingers like water through a broken dam. The investigator who entered that forest believed in facts and evidence. The man who emerged knows the most important truths can't be photographed or filed, only felt in the hollow space where our connection to the earth used to live. And I'm terrified we'll only remember what we've lost when there's nothing left to lose. What would you sacrifice to hear what the earth is trying to tell us? Subscribe to remember what we've forgotten.